with the old breed, Disc 10.
Chapter 12. Of Mud and Maggots. The boundary between the 3rd Amphibious Corps, Marines, and the 24th Corps, Army, ran through the middle of the main Japanese defensive position on the heights of Shuri. As the Marines moved southward, the 1st Marine Division remained on the left in the 3rd Amphibious Corps' zone of action, with the 6th Marine Division on the right. Within the 1st Marine Division zone of action, the 7th Marines occupied the left flank and the 5th Marines the right. The 1st Marines was in reserve. Beyond Awacha Dakeshi, the Marines next faced Wana Ridge. On the other side of Wana Ridge lay Wana Draw, through which meandered the Asatogawa. Forming the southern high ground above Wana Draw was yet another ridge, this one extending eastward from the city of Naha and rising to the Shuri Heights. This second ridge formed a part of the main Japanese defensive positions, the Shuri Line. Wana Draw aimed like an arrow from the northwest directly into the heart of the Japanese defenses at Shuri. Within this natural avenue of approach, the Japanese took advantage of every difficult feature of terrain. It couldn't have provided a better opportunity for their defense if they had designed it. The longest and bloodiest ordeal of the battle for Okinawa now faced the men of the 1st Marine Division. For the attack against Wana on 15 May 1945, the 5th Marines sent 2-5 forward with 3-5 in close support. The 1st Battalion came behind in reserve. Before 2-5's attack began, we moved into a position behind that battalion. We watched tanks firing 75s and M7s firing 105s thoroughly shell the draw. The tanks received such heavy Japanese fire in return that the riflemen of 2-5 assigned to attack with the tanks had to seek any protection they could in ditches and holes while they covered the tanks from a distance. No man on his feet could have survived the hail of shells the enemy fired at the tanks, and the tanks couldn't move safely beyond the cover the riflemen provided because of Japanese suicide tank destroyer teams. Finally, we saw the tanks pull back after suffering some hits. Our artillery and naval gunfire threw a terrific barrage at the Japanese positions around the draw. Shortly after that, the tanks withdrew. Then an airstrike was made against the draw. The bombardment of the draw seemed very heavy to us, but it wasn't anything compared to what was to become necessary before the draw was taken. We moved from one position to another behind 2-5 until I was so confused I had no idea where we were. Late in the afternoon, we halted temporarily along a muddy trail running along the treeless slope of a muddy ridge. Marines of 2-5 moved past us going the other direction. Japanese shells whistled across the ridge and burst to the rear. Our artillery roared and swished overhead, the explosions booming and thundering out in the draw across the ridge. Nearby, our regimental Protestant chaplain had set up a little altar made out of a box from which he was administering Holy Communion to a small group of dirty Marines. I glanced at the face of a Marine opposite me as the file halted. He was filthy like all of us, but even through a thickly mud-caked dark beard, I could see he had fine features. His eyes were bloodshot and weary. He slowly lowered his light machine gun from his shoulder, set the handle on his toe to keep it off the mud, and steadied the barrel with his hand. He watched the chaplain with an expression of skepticism that seemed to ask, "What's the use of all that? Is it going to keep them guys from getting hit?" That face was so weary but so expressive that I knew he, like all of us, couldn't help but have doubts about his God in the presence of constant shock and suffering. Why did it go on and on? The machine gunner's buddy held the gun's tripod on his shoulder, glanced briefly at the muddy little communion service, and then stared blankly off toward a clump of pines to our rear, as though He hoped to see home back there somewhere. "Move out," came along their file. The machine gunner hoisted the heavy weapon onto his shoulder as they went slipping and sliding around a bend in the trail into the gathering dusk. We were told to spread out, take cover, and await further orders. Some of us found holes, others scooped out what they could. Soon several Japanese shells exploded not far from me. I heard a shout for a corpsman, and then, "Hey, you guys, Doc Caswell got hit." I forgot about the shells and felt sick. I ran in the direction of the shout to look for Kent Caswell, praying with every step that he wasn't hurt badly. Several other Marines were already with Doc, and a fellow corpsman was bandaging his neck. Doc Caswell lay back in the foxhole and looked up at me as I bent over him and asked him how he was doing. No doubt a stupid question, but my throat was constricted with grief. He opened his lips to speak, and blood trickled out from between them. I was heartbroken, because I didn't see how he could possibly survive. I feared that vital blood vessels in his neck had been severed by the shell fragments. "Don't talk, Doc. They'll get you out of here and you'll be okay," I managed to stammer. "Okay, you guys, let's get him out of here," the corpsman said as he finished his aid. As I said so long to Doc and got up to leave, I noticed a cloverleaf of 60mm mortar shells lying on the side of the foxhole. A shell fragment had sliced a gash through the thick black metal end plate. I shuddered as I wondered whether it had passed first through Doc's neck. Sometime later, we learned that Doc had survived the trip to the aid station with the stretcher team and that he would live. He returned to his native Texas, where he remains one of my most faithful friends from our days in K-35. Our massive artillery, mortar, naval gunfire, and aerial bombardment continued against Wana Draw on our front and Wana Ridge on our left. The Japanese continued to shell everything and everybody in the area, meeting each tank infantry attack with a storm of fire. A total of 30 tanks, including 4 flamethrowers, blasted and burned Wana Draw. Our artillery, heavy mortars, ships' guns, and planes then plastered the enemy positions all over again, until the noise and shock made me wonder what it was like to be in a quiet place. We had been under and around plenty of heavy stuff at Peleliu, but not on nearly so massive a scale, or for such unending periods of time as at Wana. The thunderous American barrages went on for hours and then days. In return, the Japanese threw plenty of shells our way. I had a continuous headache I'll never forget. Those thunderous, prolonged barrages imposed on me a sense of stupefaction and dullness far beyond anything I had ever experienced before. It didn't seem possible for any human being to be under such thunderous chaos for days and nights on end and be unaffected by it, even when most of it was our own supporting weapons, and we were in a good foxhole. How did the Japanese stand up under it? They simply remained deep in their caves until it stopped, and then swarmed up to repulse each attack, just as they had done at Peleliu. So our heavy guns and airstrikes had to knock down, cave in, or otherwise destroy the enemy's well-constructed defensive positions. At some time during the fight for Wana Draw, we crossed what I supposed was the draw itself, somewhere near its mouth. To get to that point, we fought for days. I had lost count of how many. Marines of 2-5 had just gone across under fire, while we waited in an open field to move across. We eased up to the edge of the draw to cross in dispersed order. An NCO ordered 3 men and me to cross at a particular point and to stay close behind the 2-5 troops directly across the draw from us. The other side looked mighty far away. Japanese machine guns were firing down the draw from our left, and our artillery was swishing overhead. "Haul ass and don't stop for anything till you get across," said our NCO. We could see other Marines of our battalion starting across on our right. He told me to leave my mortar ammo bag and that someone else would bring it. I had the Thompson submachine gun slung over my shoulder. We left the field and slid down a 10-foot embankment to the sloping floor of the draw. My feet hit the deck running. The man ahead of me was a Company K veteran whom I knew well, but the other two were replacements. One I knew by name, but the other not at all. I ran as fast as I could and was glad I was carrying only my Tommy, pistol, and combat pack. The valley sloped downward toward a little stream and then upward to the ridge beyond. The Japanese machine guns rattled away. Bullets zipped and snapped around my head, the tracers like long white streaks. I looked neither right nor left, but with my heart in my throat, raced out, splashed across the little stream, and dashed up the slope to the shelter of a spur of ridge projecting out into the draw to our left. We must have run about 300 yards or more to get across. Once behind the spur, I was out of the line of machine gun fire, so I slowed to a trot. The veteran ahead of me and a little to my right slowed up too. We glanced back to see where the two new men were. Neither one of them had made more than a few strides out into the draw from the other side. One was sprawled in a heap, obviously killed instantly. The other was wounded and crawling back. Some Marines ran out, crouching low to drag him to safety. "Jesus, that was close, Sledgehammer," said the man with me. "Yeah," I gasped. That was all I could say. We went up the slope and contacted a couple of riflemen from 2-5. "We got a kid right over there, just got hit. Can you guys get him out?" one of them said. "There's some corpsmen set up in a ravine along the ridge there." He pointed out the location of the casualty and then the dressing station. We hailed 2 Company K men coming along the ridge, and they said they would help. One ran back along the ridge to get a stretcher. We other 3 moved up the ridge and into some brush, where we found the wounded Marine. He lay on his back, still clutching his rifle. As we came up, he said, "Boy, am I glad to see you guys." "You hit bad?" I asked as I knelt beside him. "Look out, you guys, Nips right over there in the bushes." I unslung my Tommy, and watching where he indicated the Japanese were, I talked to him. My 2 buddies knelt beside us with their weapons ready, watching for enemy soldiers through the brush while we waited for the stretcher. "Where you hit?" I asked the wounded Marine. "Right here," he said, pointing to the lower right portion of his abdomen. He was talkative and seemed in no pain, obviously still shocked and dazed from his wound. I knew he would hurt badly soon, because he was hit in a painful area. I saw a smear of blood around a tear in his dungaree trousers, so I unhooked his cartridge belt and then his belt and his trousers to see how serious the wound was. It wasn't the round, neat hole of a bullet, but the gash characteristic of a shell fragment. About 2 inches long, it oozed a small amount of blood. "What hit you?" I asked. "Our Company 60 mortars," answered the wounded Marine. I felt a sharp twinge of conscience and thought some 60-millimeter mortar men in the poor guy's own company fouled up and dropped some short rounds. Almost as though he had read my thoughts, he continued, "It was my own damn fault I got hit, though. We were ordered to halt back there a way and wait while the mortars shelled this area. But I saw a damn nip and figured if I got a little closer, I could get a clear shot of the son of a bitch. When I got here, the mortars came in and I got hit. Guess I'm lucky it wasn't worse. I guess the nip slipped away." "You better take it easy now," I said as the stretcher came up. We got the young Marine on the stretcher, put his rifle and helmet alongside him, and moved back down the ridge a little way to a corpsman. Several corpsmen were at work in a deep ravine cut into the ridge by erosion. It had sheer walls and a level floor and was perfectly protected. About a dozen wounded, stretcher cases, and walking wounded were there already. As we set our casualty onto the floor of the ravine, he said, "Thanks a lot, you guys. Good luck." We wished him luck and a quick trip to the States. Before we left, I paused and watched the corpsmen a moment. It was admirable how efficiently they handled the wounded, with more coming in continuously as stretcher teams left for evacuation centers with those already given field first aid. We split up, moved apart a little, and sought shelter along the slope to await orders. I found a commodious two-man standing foxhole commanding a perfect wide view of the draw for a long distance, right and left. It obviously had been used as a defensive position against any movement in the draw, and probably had sheltered a couple of Japanese riflemen, or perhaps a light machine gunner. The hole was well dug in dry clay soil. The ridge sloped up steeply behind it, but the hole and its surroundings were devoid of any enemy equipment or trash of any kind. There wasn't so much as an enemy cartridge case or ammo carton to be seen. But there were enemy tracks in the soft soil thrown out of the hole, tracks of Tabi sneakers and hobnail sole field shoes. The Japanese had become so security conscious they not only removed their dead when possible, but sometimes even picked up their expended brass, just as we did on a rifle range. Sometimes all we found were bloodstains on the ground where one had been killed or wounded. They removed everything they could, when possible, to conceal their casualties. But when they removed even empty cartridge cases, and we found only tracks, we got an eerie feeling, as though we were fighting a phantom enemy. During their battle on the Motobu Peninsula in April, Marines of the 6th Division had seen evidence of increased security consciousness on the part of the Japanese. But we had seen nothing like it on Peleliu, and Guadalcanal veterans had told me nearly every Japanese they field stripped had a diary on him. The same was said about Gloucester. After sitting out another thunderous barrage of friendly artillery fire, the three of us shouldered our weapons and moved along the ridge to rejoin Company K. Once together, our company formed into extended file and headed westward toward the regimental right flank. I lost track of the date as we moved about for several days. The shell-blasted terrain was treeless and increasingly low and flat. We dug in, were shelled off and were thoroughly bewildered as to where we were, other than we were said to be still somewhere in Wana Draw. Shuri loomed to our left front. About that time, Bergen was wounded. He was hit in the back of the neck by a shell fragment. Fortunately, he wasn't killed. Bergen was a Texan and as fine a sergeant as I ever saw. He was a Gloucester veteran whose luck had run out. We would miss him from the mortar section, and were delighted when he returned later after 18 days of convalescence. The weather turned cloudy on 21 May and the rains began. By midnight, the drizzle became a deluge. It was the beginning of a 10-day period of torrential rains. The weather was chilly, and mud was everywhere. We slipped and slid along the trails with every step we took. While the 1st Marine Division was fighting the costly, heartbreaking battle against the Wana positions, the 6th Marine Division, on the right and slightly forward, had been fighting a terrible battle for Sugarloaf Hill. Sugarloaf and the surrounding pieces of prominent terrain, the Horseshoe and Half Moon, were located on the main ridge running from Naha to Shuri. Like Wana, they were key Japanese defensive positions in the complex that guarded the Shuri Heights. During the morning of 23 May, the boundary between the 1st Marine Division and the 6th Marine Division shifted to the right, west, so the latter could rearrange its lines. The 3rd Battalion 5th Marines went into line on the right to take over the extended front. I remember the move vividly, because we entered the worst area I ever saw on a battlefield. And we stayed there more than a week. I shudder at the memory of it. We shouldered our weapons and gear, and the column telescoped its way circuitously through muddy draws, slipping and sliding along the slopes of barren hills to avoid observation and consequent shelling by the enemy. It rained off and on. The mud got worse the farther we went. As we approached our destination, the Japanese dead, scattered about in most areas since 1 May, became more numerous. When we had dug in near enemy dead and conditions permitted, we always shoveled soil over them in a vain effort to cut down the stench and to control the swarming flies. But the desperate fighting for 10 days against and around Sugarloaf Hill and the continued prolonged Japanese artillery and mortar fire had made it impossible for the Marine units there to bury the enemy dead. We soon saw that it also had been impossible to remove many Marine dead. They lay where they had fallen, an uncommon sight even to the veterans in our ranks. It was a strong Marine tradition to move our dead, sometimes even at considerable risk, to an area where they could be covered with a poncho and later collected by the graves registration people. But efforts to remove many Marines killed in the area we entered had been in vain, even after Sugarloaf Hill had been captured following days of terrible fighting. The rains had begun 21 May, almost as soon as Sugarloaf Hill had been secured by men of the 6th Marine Division. Because of the deep mud, the able-bodied could scarcely rescue and evacuate their wounded and bring up vital ammo and rations. Regrettably, the dead had to wait. It couldn't have been otherwise. We slogged along through a muddy draw around the base of a knoll. On our left, we saw 6 Marine corpses. They were lying face down against a gentle muddy slope where they apparently had hugged the deck to escape Japanese shells. They were bunched up, in a row side by side, scarcely a foot apart. They were so close together that they probably had all been killed by the same shell. Their browning faces lay against the mud in an even row. One could imagine the words of fear or reassurance that had been passed among them as they lay under the terror of the shelling. Each clutched a rusting rifle, and every sign indicated that those tragic figures were new replacements, fresh to the shock of combat. The first man's left hand was extended forward, palm down. His fingers clutched the mud in a death grip. A beautiful, shiny gold watch was held in place around the decaying wrist by an elaborate gold metal stretch band. Most of the men I knew, and myself, wore plain, simple, luminous dial, waterproof, shockproof wristwatches with a plain green cloth wristband. How strange, I thought, for a Marine to wear a flashy, conspicuous watch while on the front lines. Stranger still that some Japanese hadn't slipped out during a dark night and taken it. As we filed past the dead Marines, each of my buddies turned his head and gazed at the horrible spectacle with an expression that revealed how much the scene inwardly sickened us all. I had heard and read that combat troops in many wars became hardened and insensitive to the sight of their own dead. I didn't find that to be the case at all with my comrades. The sight of dead Japanese didn't bother us in the least, but the sight of a Marine dead brought forth regret, never indifference. Half Moon Hill. While the artillery swished and whined overhead in both directions, we moved to our new positions in the westernmost extension of Wana Draw. By 2s and 3s, the company K men forming the front line eased onto a barren, muddy, shell-torn ridge named Half Moon Hill and into the foxholes of the company we were relieving. Our mortar section went into place behind a low rise of ground below the ridge and about 100 yards back of the front lines. The terrain between us and Half Moon was nearly flat. The little elevation behind which we emplaced our guns was so low that when we stood up beside the gun pit, we could see clearly up to the company's forward lines on the ridge. Readily visible beyond that, to the left front, were the still higher, smoke-shrouded Shuri Heights, the heart of the Japanese defensive system. That ominous and formidable terrain feature was constantly under bombardment of varying intensity from our artillery, heavy mortars, and gunfire support ships. No matter, though, It didn't seem to deter the enemy observers from directing their artillery and heavy mortars in shelling our whole area frequently, every day and every night. We faced south on Half Moon. A narrow-gauge railroad track lay a short distance to our right and ran south through a flat area between Half Moon and a ridge to our right, known as the Horseshoe. Beyond that, it swung westward toward Naha. An officer told us that the ridge to our right, west, and slightly to our rear across the railroad was Sugarloaf Hill. Company K was on the right flank of 3-5 and moved up onto the western part of the base of Half Moon. The Japanese still occupied caves in both of the southward-pointing tips of the crescent. The right flank foxhole of our company was dug on the crest at the western edge of the end of the base of Half Moon. Below it, to the right, the ridge dropped away to low, flat ground. Our company's CP was situated in the sunken railroad bed to the right of our mortar section's position. A nice tarpaulin was stretched over the CP from one side of the railroad embankment to the other. This kept the post snug and dry, while torrents of chilly rain kept shivering riflemen, machine gunners, and mortarmen soaked, cold, and miserable day and night in open foxholes. The rain greeted us as we moved into our assigned area. The almost continuous downpour that started on 21 May turned Wana Draw into a sea of mud and water that resembled a lake. Tanks bogged down, and even Amtraks could not negotiate the morass. Living conditions on the front lines were pitiful. Supply and evacuation problems were severe. Food, water, and ammunition were scarce. Foxholes had to be bailed out constantly. The men's clothing, shoes, feet, and bodies remained constantly wet. Sleep was nearly impossible. The mental and physical strain took a mounting toll on the Marines. Making an almost impossible situation worse were the deteriorating bodies of Marines and Japanese that lay just outside the foxholes where they had fallen during the 5 days of ferocious fighting that preceded Company K's arrival on Half Moon. Each day's fighting saw the number of corpses increase. Flies multiplied, and amoebic dysentery broke out. The men of Company K, together with the rest of the 1st Marine Division, would live and fight in that hell for 10 days. We dispersed our guns and dug gun pits as best we could in the mud. Snafu and I took compass readings and set aiming stakes based on the readings from our observer. As soon as we fired a couple of rounds of HE to register in my gun, it was obvious we had a bad problem with the base plate of our mortar being driven farther into the soft soil with the recoil of each shell. We reasoned the rain would soon stop, however, or if it didn't, a couple of pieces of ammo box under the base plate would hold it firm. What a mistake. After digging in the gun, registering in on the aiming stakes, and preparing ammo for future use, I had my first opportunity to look around our position. It was the most ghastly corner of hell I had ever witnessed. As far as I could see, an area that previously had been a low grassy valley with a picturesque stream meandering through it was a muddy, repulsive, open sore on the land. The place was choked with the putrefaction of death, decay, and destruction. In a shallow defilade to our right, between my gun pit and the railroad, lay about 20 dead Marines, each on a stretcher and covered to his ankles with a poncho, a commonplace, albeit tragic, scene to every veteran. Those bodies had been placed there to await transport to the rear for burial. At least those dead were covered from the torrents of rain that had made them miserable in life, and from the swarms of flies that sought to hasten their decay. But as I looked about, I saw that other Marine dead couldn't be tended properly. The whole area was pocked with shell craters and churned up by explosions. Every crater was half full of water, and many of them held a Marine corpse. The bodies lay pathetically just as they had been killed, half submerged in muck and water, rusting weapons still in hand. Swarms of big flies hovered about them. "Why ain't them poor guys been covered with ponchos?" mumbled my foxhole buddy as he glanced grimly about with a distraught expression on his grizzled face. His answer came the moment he spoke. Japanese 75mm shells came whining and whistling into the area. We cowered in our hole as they crashed and thundered around us. The enemy gunners on the commanding Shuri heights were registering their artillery and mortars on our positions. We realized quickly that any time any of us moved out of our holes, the shelling began immediately. We had a terrible time getting our wounded evacuated through the shell fire and mud without the casualty and stretcher bearers getting hit. Thus it was perfectly clear why the Marine dead were left where they had fallen. Everywhere lay Japanese corpses, killed in the heavy fighting. Infantry equipment of every type, U.S. and Japanese, was scattered about. Helmets, rifles, BARs, packs, cartridge belts, canteens, shoes, ammo boxes, shell cases, machine gun ammo belts, all were strewn around us up to and all over Half Moon. The mud was knee-deep in some places, probably deeper in others if one dared venture there. For several feet around every corpse, maggots crawled about in the muck and then were washed away by the runoff of the rain. There wasn't a tree or bush left. All was open country. Shells had torn up the turf so completely that ground cover was non-existent. The rain poured down on us as evening approached. The scene was nothing but mud, shell fire, flooded craters with their silent, pathetic, rotting occupants, knocked out tanks and Amtraks, and discarded equipment. Utter desolation. The stench of death was overpowering. The only way I could bear the monstrous horror of it all was to look upward away from the earthly reality surrounding us, watch the leaden gray clouds go scudding over, and repeat over and over to myself that the situation was unreal, just a nightmare, that I would soon awake and find myself somewhere else. But the ever-present smell of death saturated my nostrils. It was there with every breath I took. I existed from moment to moment, sometimes thinking death would have been preferable. We were in the depths of the abyss, the ultimate horror of war. During the fighting around the Umerbrogel pocket on Peleliu, I had been depressed by the wastage of human lives. But in the mud and driving rain before Shuri, we were surrounded by maggots and decay. Men struggled and fought and bled in an environment so degrading I believed we had been flung into hell's own cesspool. Not long after 3-5 took over Half Moon, several of us were on a work party, struggling through knee-deep mud to bring ammo from the rear up to the mortar positions. We passed near the company's CP in the railroad bed. "Hey, you guys, look there. Stumpy's in bad shape," said a Marine in an excited, low voice. We all stopped and looked toward the CP. There was our CO, Stumpy Stanley, just outside the edge of the tarpaulin, trying to stand by himself. But he had to be supported by a man on each side. He looked haggard and weary and was shaking violently with malarial chills. He could barely hold up his head. The men supporting him seemed to be arguing with him. He was objecting as best he could, but it was a feeble effort because he was so sick. "Po Stumpy got that goddamn bug so bad he can't hardly stand up. But look there, he's all man, by God. He don't want to be evacuated," said Snafu gravely. "He's a damn good Joe," someone else said. We thought highly of Stumpy and respected him greatly. He was a good skipper, and we had confidence in him. But malaria made him too ill to stay on his feet. The chilly rain, the emotional stress, and the physical exertion and strain of those days were enough to make a well man collapse. Obviously, those who had malarial infections couldn't possibly keep going. So, for the second time in May, we lost our commanding officer. Stumpy was the last of our Peleliu officers, and his evacuation ended an era for me. He was the last tie to Captain Andy Haldane. For me, Company K was never the same after that day. As we feared, Shadow became the CO. It's best that I don't record what we said about that. At daybreak, the morning after we took over the line on Half Moon, George Sarrett and I went up onto the ridge to our observation post. Half Moon was shaped like a crescent, with the arms pointing southward. Our battalion line stretched along the crest of the ridge as it formed the base of the crescent. The arms extended outward beyond our front lines, and Japanese occupied caves in the reverse slopes of those arms, particularly the one on the left, east. They made our line a hot spot. To our front, the ridge sloped down sharply from the crest, then more gently all the way to a big road embankment approximately 300 yards out and running parallel to our lines. A large culvert opened toward us through the embankment. The area to our front was well drained and as bare as the back of one's hand. It wasn't heavily cratered. 2 shallow ditches about 50 yards apart ran across the area between the southern tips of the Half Moon. These ditches were closer to the road embankment than to our lines. The sloping area leading to the culvert resembled an amphitheater bordered by the base of the crescent where we were, to the north, the arms of the crescent extending southward, and the high road embankment running east and west at the southern end. Our visibility within the amphitheater was perfect, except for the reverse slopes of the arms of the crescent. Marines of 2-4 had warned us, as they departed, that the Japanese came out of the caves in the reverse slopes of the crescent's arms at night, and generally raised hell. To combat that, our ships kept star shells aloft, and our 60mm mortars kept flares burning in the wet sky above the ridge all night. Every night we were there. As the dawn light grew brighter, we could see the lay of the land through the drizzle and thin fog. So we registered the mortar section's 3 guns with an aiming stake on one of each of 3 important terrain features. We had 1 gun register in on the reverse slope of the left-hand extension of the Half Moon. A second mortar we registered on the reverse slope of the road embankment. We registered the 3rd gun to cover the area around the mouth of the culvert. No sooner had we registered the guns than we got a reaction. Big 90mm Japanese mortar shells began crashing along the crest of the ridge. They came so thick and so fast, we knew an entire enemy mortar section was firing on us, not an isolated gun. They were zeroed in on the ridge and traversed along the crest from my left to the far right end of the company's line. It was an awful pounding. Each big shell fluttered and swished down and went off with a flash and an ear-splitting crash. Shrapnel growled through the air, and several men were wounded badly. Each shell threw stinking mud around when it exploded. The wounded were moved down behind the ridge with great difficulty because of the slippery, muddy slopes. A corpsman gave them aid, and they were carried to the rear, shocked, torn, and bleeding. An uneasy quiet then settled along the line. Suddenly someone yelled, "There goes one!" A single Japanese soldier dashed out of the blackness of the culvert. He carried his bayoneted rifle and wore a full pack. He ran into the open, turned, and headed for shelter behind the tip of the southern end of the crescent arm on our left front. It looked as though he had about a 30-yard dash to make. Several of our riflemen and BAR men opened up, and the soldier was bowled over by their bullets before he reached the shelter of the ridge. Our men cheered and yelled when he went down. As the day wore on, more Japanese ran out of the culvert in 1s and 2s and dashed for the shelter of the same ridge extension. It was obvious they wanted to concentrate on the reverse slope there, from where they could launch counterattacks, raids, and infiltration attempts on our front line. Obviously, it was to our best interest to stop them as quickly as possible. Any enemy soldier who made it in behind that slope might become one's unwelcome foxhole companion some night. When the Japanese ran out of the culvert, our men fired on them and nearly always knocked them down. The riflemen, BAR men, and machine gunners looked on it as fine target practice because we received no return small arms fire, and the Japanese mortars were quiet. I kept busy with the field glasses, observing, adjusting range, and calling fire orders onto the slope and the road embankment. I had the Tommy with me, but it wasn't as steady and accurate at the 200 to 300 yard range as an M1 Garand rifle. We had an M1 and an ammo belt in our OP, though, and I wanted to throw down that phone and the field glasses and grab up that M1 every time an enemy popped into view. As long as our mortar section was firing a mission, I had no choice but to continue observing. The Japanese kept up their efforts to move behind the slope. Some made it because our men missed them. Our 60mm mortar shells crashed away steadily on the target areas. We could see Japanese emerge from the culvert and be killed by our shells. The longer this action continued, without our receiving any return fire, the more relaxed my buddies became. The situation began to take on certain aspects of a rifle range, or more likely an old-fashioned turkey shoot. My buddies started making bets about who had hit which Japanese. Lively arguments developed. But with rifles, BARs, and several machine guns firing simultaneously, no one could tell for sure who hit which enemy soldier. The men yelled and joked more and more in one of their few releases from weeks of tension under the pounding of heavy weapons. So they began to get careless and to miss some of the Japanese scurrying for the slope. Shadow saw this. He ran up and down our firing line, cursing and yelling at everybody. Then the men settled down and took more careful aim. Finally, the enemy stopped coming, and I received orders to call "cease firing" to our mortars. We sat and waited. During the lull, I moved over into the machine gun emplacement next to our mortar OP to visit with the gunner. It contained a Browning .30 caliber water-cooled heavy machine gun manned by a gunner who had joined Company K as a replacement after Peleliu. On Pavuvu, he and I had become good friends. We called him Kathy, after a chorus girl he knew in California. He was married and very much in love with his wife, so he bore a heavy burden of guilt because he had had an affair with Kathy on his way overseas and couldn't get her out of his mind. As we sat alone in the machine gun pit, he asked me whether I wanted to see a picture of Kathy. I said yes. He carefully and secretively picked up his rain-soaked combat pack and took out a waterproof plastic map holder. Folding back the canvas cover, he said, "Here she is." My eyes nearly popped out of my head. The 8x10-inch photo was a full-length portrait of one of the most beautiful girls I ever saw. She was dressed, or undressed, in a scanty costume which exposed a good portion of her impressive physical endowments. I gasped audibly, and Kathy said, "Isn't she a beauty?" "She really is," I told him, and added, "You've got a problem on your hands with a girl like that chorus girl and a wife you love." I kidded him about the possible danger of getting the letters to his wife and his girl crossed up and in the wrong envelopes. He just laughed and shook his head as he looked at the photo of the beautiful girl. The scene was so unreal, I could barely believe it. Two tired, frightened young men sitting in a hole beside a machine gun in the rain on a ridge, surrounded with mud. Nothing but stinking mud, with so much decaying human flesh buried or half-buried in it that there were big patches of wriggling fat maggots marking the spots where Japanese corpses lay. Looking at the picture of a beautiful semi-nude girl. She was a pearl in a mud hole. Viewing that picture made me realize with a shock that I had gradually come to doubt that there really was a place in the world where there were no explosions and people weren't bleeding, suffering, dying, or rotting in the mud. I felt a sense of desperation that my mind was being affected by what we were experiencing. Men cracked up frequently in such places as that. I had seen it happen many times by then. In World War I, they had called it shell shock, or, more technically, neurasthenia. In World War II, the term used was combat fatigue. Strange that such a picture provoked such thoughts. But I vividly recall grimly making a pledge to myself. The Japanese might kill or wound me, but they wouldn't make me crack up. A peaceful civilian back home who sat around worrying about losing his mind probably didn't have much to occupy him. But in our situation, there was plenty of reason for the strongest-willed individuals to crack up. My secret resolve helped me through the long days and nights we remained in the worst of the abyss. But there were times at night during that period when I felt I was slipping. More than once my imagination ran wild during the brief periods of darkness when the flares and star shells burned out. "There comes another one," somebody yelled. Kathy quickly stowed his picture in his pack, spun around, gripped the machine gun handle in his left hand, poised his trigger finger, and grabbed the aiming knob with his right hand. His assistant gunner appeared from out of nowhere and jumped to his post to feed the ammo belt into the gun. I started back to the OP hole, but saw that George had phone in hand and the mortars were still secured. So I grabbed up an M1 rifle Kathy had in the machine gun emplacement. I saw enemy soldiers rushing out of the culvert. Our line started firing as I counted the 10th Japanese to emerge. Those incredibly brave soldiers formed a skirmish line abreast, with a few yards between each other, and started trotting silently toward us across open ground about 300 yards away. Their effort was admirable, but so hopeless. They had no supporting fire of any kind to pin us down, or even make us cautious. They looked as though they were on maneuvers. They had no chance of getting close to us. I stood up beside the machine gun, took aim, and started squeezing off shots. The Japanese held their rifles at port arms and didn't even fire at us. Everybody along our line was yelling and firing. The enemy soldiers wore full battle gear with packs, which meant they had rations and extra ammo. So this might be the beginning of a counterattack of some size. Within seconds, 8 of the 10 enemy soldiers pitched forward, spun around, or slumped to the deck, dead where they fell. The remaining 2 must have realized the futility of it all, because they turned around and started back toward the culvert. Most of us slackened our fire and just watched. Several men kept firing at the 2 retreating enemy soldiers, but missed, and it looked as though they might get away. Finally, one Japanese fell forward near one of the shallow ditches. The surviving soldier kept going. Just as Kathy got his machine gun sights zeroed in on him, the order, "Cease firing," came along the line. But the machine gun was making so much noise we didn't hear the order. Kathy had his ammo belts loaded so that about every 5th cartridge was a tracer. He squeezed off a long burst of about 8 shots. The bullets struck the fleeing Japanese soldier in the middle of his pack and tore into him between his shoulders. I was standing directly behind Kathy, looking along his machine gun barrel. The tracers must have struck the man's vertebrae or other bones and been deflected, because I clearly saw one tracer flash up into the air out of the soldier's right shoulder, and another tracer come out of the top of his left shoulder. The Japanese dropped his rifle as the slugs knocked him face down into the mud. He didn't move. "I got him! I got the bastard!" Kathy yelled, jumping around, slapping me on the back, and shaking hands with his assistant gunner. He had reason to be proud. He had made a good shot. The enemy soldier who fell near the ditch began crawling and flopped into it. Some of the men started firing at him again. The bullets kicked up mud all around the soldier as he slithered desperately along in the shallow ditch, which didn't quite hide him. Machine gun tracers ricocheted off the ground like vicious red arrows as the Japanese struggled along the shallow ditch. Then, on one of the rare occasions I ever saw compassion expressed for the Japanese by a Marine who had to fight them, one of our men yelled, "Knock it off, you guys. The poor bastard's already hit, and he ain't got a snowball's chance in hell." Someone else yelled angrily, "You stupid jerk, he's a goddamn nip, ain't he? You going Asiatic or something?" The firing continued, and bullets hit the mark. The wounded Japanese subsided into the muddy little ditch. He and his comrades had done their best. They died gloriously on the field of honor for the Emperor, is what their families would be told. In reality, their lives were wasted on a muddy, stinking slope for no good reason. Our men were in high spirits over the affair, especially after being pounded for so long. But Shadow was yelling, "Cease firing, you dumb bastards!" He came slipping and sliding along the line, cursing and stopping at intervals to pour out storms of invective on some smiling, muddy Marine. He carried his helmet in his left hand and periodically took off his cap and flung it down into the mud until it was caked. Each man looked glum and sat or stood motionless until Shadow had finished insulting him and moved on. As Shadow passed the machine gun pit, he stopped and screamed at Kathy, who was still jumping around in jubilation over his kill. "Knock it off, you goddamn fool!" Then he glared at me and said, "You're supposed to be observing for the mortars. Put that goddamn rifle down, you bastard." I wasn't impetuous, but had I thought I could get away with it, I would certainly have clubbed him over the head with that M1 rifle. I didn't. But Shadow's asinine conduct and comment did make me rash enough to say, "The guns are secured, sir. We were all sent out here to kill nips, weren't we? So what difference does it make what weapon we use when we get the chance?" His menacing expression turned into surprise and then doubt. With a quizzical look on his face, he cocked his head to one side as he pondered my remark, while I stood silently with the realization that I should have kept my mouth shut. The fine sergeant accompanying Shadow half glared and half smiled at me. Suddenly, without another glance, Shadow strode off along the ridge crest, cursing and yelling at the Marines in each foxhole as he passed them. I resolved to keep my mouth shut in the future. As daylight waned, I looked out to our front through the drizzling rain, falling through the still, foul air. A wisp of smoke rose straight up from the pack of the Japanese soldier Kathy had shot. The tracers had set something on fire. The thin finger of smoke rose high and then spread out abruptly to form a disk that appeared to rest on the column. So delicate and unreal, the smoke stood in the stagnant, fetid air like a marker over the corpse. Everything out there was motionless, only death and desolation among the enemy bodies. George and I got orders to return to our mortar gun pits. Someone else would man the OP for the night. Getting back to the mortar emplacements from the company's front line was a major effort and an extremely dangerous one. From the moment we stepped to the rear of the crest of the ridge to descend the muddy slope, it was like trying to walk down a greased slide. A large and unknown number of Japanese all over the ridge had been killed during the early counterattacks. They had been covered with soil as soon as possible, and Japanese were still being killed out front. Infiltrators also were being killed all along the ridge at night. Our men could only spade mud over them. The situation was bad enough, but when enemy artillery shells exploded in the area, the eruptions of soil and mud uncovered previously buried Japanese dead and scattered chunks of corpses. Like the area around our gun pits, the ridge was a stinking compost pile. If a Marine slipped and slid down the back slope of the muddy ridge, he was apt to reach the bottom vomiting. I saw more than one man lose his footing and slip and slide all the way to the bottom, only to stand up horror-stricken as he watched in disbelief while fat maggots tumbled out of his muddy dungaree pockets, cartridge belt, legging lacings, and the like. Then he and a buddy would shake or scrape them away with a piece of ammo box or a knife blade. We didn't talk about such things. They were too horrible and obscene, even for hardened veterans. The conditions taxed the toughest I knew almost to the point of screaming. Nor do authors normally write about such vileness, unless they have seen it with their own eyes. It is too preposterous to think that men could actually live and fight for days and nights on end under such terrible conditions and not be driven insane. But I saw much of it there on Okinawa. And to me, the war was insanity. Chapter 13. Breakthrough. The rains became so heavy that at times we could barely see our buddies in the neighboring foxhole. We had to bail out our gun pit and foxholes during and after each downpour, or they filled with water. Snafu and I dug a deep foxhole close to the gun pit and placed pieces of wooden ammo crates across braces set on the muddy clay at the bottom. At one end of this foxhole, beyond the extension of the boards, we dug a sump. As the surface water poured into our foxhole and down under the boards, we bailed out the sump with a sea ration can for a day or two. But the soil became so saturated by continued downpours that water poured in through the four sides of the foxhole as though it were a colander. We then had to use a discarded helmet to bail out the sump, because the ration can couldn't take out water fast enough to keep up with that pouring in. The board floor kept us out of the water and mud, provided we worked diligently enough at the bailing detail. Necessity being the mother of invention, we had reinvented the equivalent of duck boards commonly used in flooded World War I trenches. The duck boards pictured and described in 1914 to 1918 in Flanders were, of course, often prefabricated in long sections and then placed in the trenches by infantrymen. But the small board floor we placed in our foxhole served the same function. Continued firing finally caused my mortar's base plate to drive the pieces of wood supporting it deep into the mud in the bottom of the gun pit. We couldn't sight the gun properly. We tugged and pulled the gun up out of the mud. Then it was a choice of emplacing it either on some firmer base in the gun pit or on the surface outside. The latter prospect would have meant sure death from the enemy's shelling, so we had to come up with something better in a hurry. Somebody got the bright idea of building a footing on which to rest the base plate. So in the bottom of the gun pit, we dug out a deep square hole larger than the base plate and lined it with boards. We next placed several helmets full of coral gravel we found in the side of the railroad bed into the footing. We set the mortar's base plate on the firm coral footing, resighted the gun, and had no more trouble with recoil driving the base plate into the mud. I suppose the other two squads in our mortar section fixed their guns' base plates in the same manner. The Japanese infantry kept up their activity to our front and tried to infiltrate our lines every night, sometimes with success. Snafu made good about then on the threat he had made to the CP on Peleliu about any enemy headed toward the Company K CP. On Peleliu one night after we came off the lines, Snafu shot 2 Japanese with his Thompson. He had killed one and fatally wounded the other. A sergeant made Snafu bury the dead soldier. Snafu objected strenuously, because he said, and rightly so, if he hadn't shot the Japanese, they would have kept on going right into the company CP. Sarge said maybe so, but the corpse had to be buried, and since Snafu had shot it, he must bury it. Snafu promised he would never shoot another enemy soldier headed for the CP. One day as dawn broke with a thin fog and a pelting rain, Snafu woke me out of the nearest thing to sleep that could be attained in that miserable place with, "Halt, who goes there? What's the password?" Jolted out of my fatigue stupor, I saw Snafu's face silhouetted against the gray sky. Rain poured off his helmet, and drops of moisture on the end of each whisker of the thick, stubbly beard on his jutting square jaw caught the dim light like glass beads. I snatched the Tommy up off my lap as he raised his .45 pistol and aimed it toward two dim figures striding along about 20 yards away. Visibility was so poor in the dim light, mist and rain, that I could tell little about the shadowy figures other than they wore U.S. helmets. At the sound of Snafu's challenge, the two men speeded up instead of halting and identifying themselves. "Halt or I'll fire," he yelled. The two took off for the railroad bed as fast as they could on the slippery ground. Snafu fired several shots with his .45 but missed. Shortly we heard a couple of American grenades explode in the railroad bed. Then a buddy yelled that the Japanese had been killed by his grenades. Daylight came rapidly, so we went over to the railroad embankment to ask what had happened. When Snafu and I got to the foxhole by the railroad embankment, we found two Marine snipers grinning and laughing. The grenade explosions had scared awake the Marines in the dryness under the tarpaulin in the company's CP and had chased them out into the rain. They were drifting back to the shelter as we arrived. We waved, but got only glares in return. We took a look at the dead enemy before returning to our foxhole. They had been wearing Marine helmets, but otherwise were dressed in Japanese uniforms. A grenade had exploded in the face of one. There was no face and little head remaining. The other wasn't as badly mangled. Snafu and I returned to our hole and got settled just in time to see Hank come stalking along from the CP. He was stopping at every foxhole along the way to find out who had been so negligent as to let the Japanese soldiers get past them and almost to the CP. Hank arrived at our foxhole and asked us why we hadn't seen the two soldiers pass if one of us was on watch as we were supposed to be. Snafu spoke up immediately and said, "Hell, I saw 'em go right by here, but I reckoned they was headed for the company's CP." He didn't mention his challenging the Japanese or firing at them. Hank looked astonished and said, "What do you mean, Snafu?" Snafu swelled with indignation and answered, "You remember when they made me bury that nip I shot on Peleliu when them two was headed for the CP?" "Yeah, so what?" answered Hank in a low, menacing voice. "Well, I told them then if they made me bury 'em, then by God, next time I seen a nip heading for the CP, I wasn't going to stop 'em." I groaned in a low voice. "Oh, shut up, Snafu." One didn't talk like that to a senior NCO and get away with it. Hank was a very formidable person and merited the tremendous respect we felt for him. But woe be unto the Marine who didn't do a task properly and incurred his wrath. Hank treated us with respect and compassion, if we followed orders and did our best. I had no desire to see what he would do to someone who didn't, but I thought I was about to. So I turned my head and half-closed my eyes, as did all the awestruck men in the foxholes within earshot who had been watching Snafu and Hank. Nothing happened. I glanced at Snafu and Hank as they stood there glaring at each other, a bantam rooster glaring up at a mighty eagle. Finally, Hank said, "You'd better not let that happen again." He turned and stalked back to the CP. Snafu mumbled and grumbled. The rest of us sighed with relief. I fully expected Hank at least to order Snafu to bury the two Japanese down there on the railroad, and then Snafu, as my corporal, would order me onto the burial detail as had happened on Peleliu. But he didn't, and someone else spaded mud over the two corpses. Much later, when Hank was leaving Company K for home after an outstanding record in 3 campaigns, I asked him what he had thought about that incident. He just looked at me and grinned, but wouldn't say anything about it. His grin revealed, however, that he respected Snafu and knew he wasn't lax in any way, and probably that he himself had been ordered by some officer to look into the affair. Because of the surroundings, our casualties during the stalemate on Half Moon were some of the most pathetic I ever had seen. Certainly a beautiful landscape didn't make a wound less painful or a death less tragic, but our situation before Shuri was the most awful place conceivable for a man to be hurt or to die. Most of the wounds resulted from enemy shell fragments, but it seemed to me we had more than the usual number of cases of blast concussion from exploding shells. That was understandable because of the frequent heavy shellings we were subjected to. All the casualties were muddy and soaking wet like the rest of us. That seemed to accentuate the bloody battle dressings on their wounds and their dull expressions of shock and pain, which made the horror and hopelessness of it all more vivid as we struggled through the chilly driving rain and deep mud to evacuate them. Some of the concussion cases could walk and were helped and led. Some seemed to have no sure sense of direction, to the rear like men walking in their sleep. Some wore wild-eyed expressions of shock and fear. Others, whom I knew well, though could barely recognize, wore expressions of idiots or simpletons, knocked too witless to be afraid anymore. The blast of a shell had literally jolted them into a different state of awareness from the rest of us. Some of those who didn't return probably never recovered, but were doomed to remain in mental limbo and spend their futures in a veterans' hospital as living dead. The combat fatigue cases were distressing. They ranged in their reactions from a state of dull detachment, seemingly unaware of their surroundings, to quiet sobbing, or all the way to wild screaming and shouting. Stress was the essential factor we had to cope with in combat, under small arms fire, and in warding off infiltrators and raiders during sleepless, rainy nights for prolonged periods. But being shelled so frequently during the prolonged Shuri stalemate seemed to increase the strain beyond that which many otherwise stable and hardened Marines could endure without mental or physical collapse. From my experience, of all the hardships and hazards the troops had to suffer, prolonged shell fire was more apt to break a man psychologically than anything else. In addition to the wounded, quite a number of men were evacuated and described in the muster rolls simply as sick. Some of them suffered attacks of malaria, others had fever, respiratory problems, or were just exhausted and seemed to have succumbed to the rigors of exposure and the chilly rains. There were numerous cases of pneumonia. Many men weren't evacuated, although they suffered serious ailments resulting from the cold rains and being soaking wet for more than a week. Most of us had serious trouble with our feet. An infantryman with sore feet was in miserable shape under the best of living conditions. During a period of about 14 or 15 days, as near as I can calculate the time, from 21 May to 5 June, my feet and those of my buddies were soaking wet, and our boondockers were caked with sticky mud. Being up on the line and frequently shelled prevented a man from taking off his boondockers to put on a pair of dry socks, and even if he had dry socks, there was no way to clean and dry the leather boondockers. Most of us removed our mud-caked canvas leggings and tucked our trouser cuffs into our sock tops, but it didn't help our feet much. Consequently, most men's feet were in bad condition. My feet were sore, and it hurt to walk or run. The insides of my boondockers gave me the sensation of being slimy when I wiggled my toes to try to warm my feet with increased circulation. The repulsive sensation of slippery, slimy feet grew worse each day. My sore feet slid back and forth inside my soaked boondockers when I walked or ran. Fortunately, they never became infected. A miracle in itself. Sore feet, caused by prolonged exposure to mud and water, was called immersion foot, I learned later. In World War I, they called the same condition trench foot. To me, it was an unforgettable sensation of extreme personal filth and painful discomfort. It was the kind of experience that would make a man sincerely grateful for the rest of his life for clean, dry socks. As simple a condition as dry socks seemed a luxury. The almost constant rain also caused the skin on my fingers to develop a strange, shrunken and wrinkled appearance. My nails softened. Sores developed on the knuckles and backs of both hands. These grew a little larger each day and hurt whenever I moved my fingers. I was always knocking the scabs off against ammo boxes and the like. Similar sores had tormented combat troops in the South Pacific campaigns and were called jungle rot, or jungle sores. After the campaign on Okinawa ended, a battalion surgeon told me the sores on my hands were probably caused by malnutrition, the filth we lived in, or both. The festering sores that developed on my hands in late May didn't heal until nearly 5 months after we came out of combat.
This ends Disc 10.